What I would like to for us to have is a glimpse of your life and as an inspiration to others, hopefully in different aspects of your life that you have experienced, that you have traveled, you've witnessed. This will be an inspiration to others. So let's go back to your childhood, where you were born and what was it like where you grew up. And do you have any stories that you remember that informed the person you are today?
That is it's a great question. And so I was born in Trinidad, in Port of Spain, in a place called St. James. And St. James, I still remember it very well. I have very fond memories, although I came here to this country. I remember going to a school called Tranquility Government School. I remember playing marbles at a distance and shooting and being able to hit something 6, 8, 9 feet away from me. And when we were leaving Trinidad, I had these huge flower tins filled with marbles, and I cried because I had to give those marbles away. I remember leaving my house and go walking just 2 or 3 streets over where the police training barracks were with the horses, and I'd stare in wonderment at these incredible creatures. And I also remember that, the doors would be open, of course, in your classrooms, and me just getting up, I guess in kindergarten or grade 6 or whatever it was, and wandering outside the school, picking up the tamarind and eating, and my younger sister just following me around. I was a dreamer. Um, Another memory I had was my father and mother we would maybe go once a month or once every 2 weeks, drive down from Port of Spain into San Fernando. I know that it's San Fernando now. I didn't know it then. And do this roundabout or flyover and head into what is Debe and Lal Bihari Trace, where I would see where many of the Indians were in these places. And I remember I had this encounter one day. It must have been a wedding of some kind. I didn't know. I was 6, 7, 8. And they had the banana leaves on the ground, and everybody sat on the ground cross-legged, and they had a rice there. And somebody was walking around behind us, and they were just pouring out the dal and whatever they were doing, the rotis and the achar. This is one of my most amazing memories because, number one, the food was incredible. The feeling was incredible. And I didn't understand how amazing and beautiful that food was till 20, 30 years later in Canada, thinking back about this kind of food and why it's so good. Um, Another memory, which was very interesting about that world, was Bengal Street, which was the street we lived on. Across from us was an older Muslim couple, an older Muslim family who were friends with my parents. Obliquely to the right was a white family and their children and dog. To the left, a couple of houses over, was some young black children. And up the road, a white family looked like they had turkeys and all that. So there was, I grew up in a multicultural world. I grew up not understanding that perhaps there was supposed to be a difference in how I see the world. I just saw all these people and took it for granted. It was much later for me that I realized that that kind of multicultural comfort does not necessarily exist in many parts of the world, and we're still grappling with it here today.
Oh yes, and it's really comforting to know that you came from St. James because I have traveled to St. James and I know the famous Hussein festival is celebrated in St. James. Do you have any memory of the Hussein festival?
You know what? I do. Interestingly enough, I do remember those drums as a kid coming down the road and incredible rhythms and the people moving in the line and swaying to that beat and chanting and all that. And interestingly enough, I also have 1 or 2 memories of carnival at the same time. So you have these, what I would call in Trinidad, this very egalitarian, very pluralistic society where there was a genuine understanding and acceptance of these different kinds of religions and festivals. It's not a problem. And in fact, when I think about it, my father was born a Hindu. He converted later on in his life as an adult to marry my mother, whose father was a Presbyterian minister. And so she was a staunch Christian. And I grew up, later on in Toronto, where a pundit, one of my father's cousins, would be coming, and my mother would be washing all the pans. We wouldn't eat any meat for a week. And we'd have these prayers on the floor, spreading out the sheets and everything clean and all that. So I grew up again without an understanding that there was really a difference in terms of how we should treat each other. I naturally thought people got along who were of different religions. And I felt that happened in Trinidad to a large extent. I never really saw that people were questioning my mother, who she was, or my father. Like I said, my parents went over the street to their Muslim friends, and when I came to this country, finally got to Toronto from Sudbury, you naturally met a whole bunch of other West Indians of all sorts of different colors. And that's how I moved for a long time in my younger life, in my teenage years and 20s.
So let's talk about your migration story. Well, like, why is it that you migrated from Trinidad to Canada, and where did you land in Canada?
My father, again, I didn't know many of these things till I was in my 20s, quite accidentally. My father, it turns out, was the youngest of 10 children. He was the only one who wasn't necessarily a farmer. He had different dreams for whatever reasons. He worked as a secretary to the captain of the US naval base somewhere outside of Port of Spain that I'd visited once or twice. He got his London GCE by correspondence, sitting and typing. He had dreams. So that was one, to make something of himself and leave this sort of small world. But I think part of the reason he wanted to leave that small world, he was secretary to a gentleman by the name of Uriah Buzz Butler, who was at that time head of the Labour Party in Trinidad, which was multiracial. It had brown and black people in it. And I'm not sure if that was entirely accepted by the political forces of the day, the late 60s and 70s. But I do remember this man, again, I would have been 6, 7, or 8, coming to my home almost every Sunday and sitting with my father for a couple of hours. He's a stout black man with a kind of a white beard and probably balding. And my father would say, go out and play. And there I'd be out in the yard again with more marbles or whatever. And I think I have better memories of him than my own father's father, who came perhaps more rarely, and my grandmother, who died on that side. So I never really knew her. And so that was an interesting thing. And the reason I found that out was in the mid 80s, I was doing a TV show called Carib Beat. And so people came up from Trinidad and tried to contact my father. And I said, or much later. And I said he'd passed away. I can't remember what it was. And they were from a group called NJAC, National Joint Action Committee or whatever, trying to again relive some sort of multicultural movement in Trinidad, and wanted to find out more about my father. And I had them on this local television show called Carib Beat, where I learned from them who my own father was, because he never really talked about his past. Like many of our people, they just quietly I don't know what it is about our people. I really don't, that would say, you know what, that's the past. I'm here in this country. I'm trying to make something for myself. Let's deal with the future.
Yeah, the humility.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you migrated to Canada. Where did you land?
We landed in Sudbury. In thinking about this interview, I want to share with you how much I've been looking forward to it, because, we have, the day-to-day things, get gas, clean the table, feed people. But it's not often people get a chance like this, and us relative strangers, we've only started to meet each other and get to know each other recently, and to talk about our lives and what forms us. And I have a memory that I really will never forget, because it was the first time I was on a plane, and I would have been 8 or 9. And I had the window seat and looking out on the way to this country called Canada that I had no idea what it was. And you see the Caribbean Sea, and you see the turquoise water, sometimes with that sun shining right down all the way to the bottom. You could see the sand. You could see the blue and the green and the teal. I'd never seen colors like it. And as the sky, it's a 6-hour flight from Trinidad, the plane is moving and the sun is coming across, and perhaps the sun is lowering itself, and it's sparkling like gems on that water. And you can see the white froth on the top of it. I'll never forget that. And we landed perhaps at dusk in Toronto, and then we took another flight, maybe a couple of hours later, and landed somewhere else. And again, we stayed at this person's home, Reverend Dr. Newberry, Presbyterian minister, who had somehow sponsored. And we lived in his home, in his basement, for a couple of months. So my parents finally got it together and found a place, and we moved into a place called Laurentian Village, which was being built in Sudbury. And Sudbury is where I spent, I would call, my formative years, and where I formed my identity as well, where I knew who I was in relation to the Canadian ethos. And that was very important at the time.
My God, who would think of a young boy out of Port of Spain playing marbles and ends up in Sudbury, not even Toronto? What did they think about you when they saw you in school?
I left that city vowing never to go back. I left that city knowing very clearly who I was, because I have very clear memories of several things. Number one, because I'm the oldest of children, us eating in some little cafe somewhere with knives and forks, as good little middle-class Trini people did, and people stopping to inquire how we learned to use knives and forks.
My God.
I remember people stopping to inquire how we learned to speak English so well, which is sort of ironic because I would have been a little Trini boy saying, "Oh God, Daddy, can I go to the," you know what I mean, this kind of thing. And in thinking about it again, I fairly remember, it must have been Gatchel Public School or whatever, some outlying thing of, I had never seen a microscope. And I was now in grade 5, 6, whatever it was, I had no idea because we were in form, this or that in Trinidad. Now we're in grade this or that.
Right.
And I remember the teacher walking to everyone and looking at them and smiling and nodding and acknowledging each of them. And then me waiting expectantly for this man to come because I don't know how to use a microscope, and him walking right past me and not paying any attention to me. That was one of my first memories, right? I remember Reverend Dr. Newberry. Within the church, he might call me up and might do a reading from the Bible. And outside of the church, nobody speaks to you. And the N-word, that was directed to me out there. Darky, pinko, shadow, and N-word in many, many ways. So I learned very quickly that I did not belong in this hinterland of Canada. And I learned as well that I was getting angry about it. I didn't know that at the time. This was now the 70s and growing along here, and I'm listening to certain kinds of music. Deep Purple Machine Head, Inagata da Vida, Magic Carpet Ride. That was the music, and me trying to grow up. I'm now 13, and that kind of feeling. But another thing that I remember too is I was in Scouts. My dad, through the local church or whatever, I think it was the church, tried to become a Scoutmaster, tried to help, etc. And I remember whether he was the Scoutmaster or not, we go to Manitoulin Island for a jamboree. And again, I must have been about 12, 13. And my friends or the people in my patrol come back to tell me while we're setting up our tents that nobody in all the jamborees were gonna do anything with me because of my color. And so my group stayed separate from that whole jamboree for that whole weekend because of me. And when I left Sudbury, I knew one thing, that the white people who were my friends were real friends because they had to take the flak for being friends with a little darky like me, right? And the people who liked me. My next door neighbor was what we would call indigenous now, a guy named Wade, an amazing young man, beautiful, straight hair hanging down, a kind of a copper brown skin. We talked very easily. He was cool compared to me. I was a skinny nerd, and I guess I still am, but I remember that. And one more thing that I do remember, and it's this. We're in a Kmart of some kind. I don't know, you would be old enough to remember the Kmart. And two tall, stately, noble, a man and a woman walked in, both long hair. And the whole place went quiet. It went silent. And what's going on here? And everybody was staring at an indigenous couple. And in my young mind, I recognized that they were treating those people as outsiders, that somehow or other was a coldness and antipathy toward them in the same way that they had it from me. And I had a connection to those people, right? As I had a connection to Wade. And it was very interesting to me in one sense, Indian, at that time, them being called Indian, or right, referring to themselves as that. So these are some of the memories I had of Sudbury. Clearly I had friends. The snow was so tall that we could build ice tunnels. Habeeb, we could build ice tunnels and I could walk upright within those tunnels to have snowball fights with people. We could climb up on the roof of the house and jump off the side into the snow of a 2-story house into the snow. There was so much snow in those days. But in those days, you also wore the right clothes for it. Yeah. Toronto has never worn the right clothes for winter. So these are some of the memories I have. So when I came out of Sudbury, I said to myself, it's very clear that I'm not a white person, that I will never be considered white. And if anything, I'm considered Black. So what I want to say right up front now, people can talk right now all the time about how I self-identify, but it is also just as much how others view us, label us, and treat us. So I think this whole argument is one-sided how I identify. If I'm treated a certain way, am I not then facing the same oppression, right?
So what was your educational journey like? High school, university?
I came to from Sudbury to Toronto in the mid 70s, and I ended up in high school. And I used to make a joke that, you know, at least Toronto was far more sophisticated because they knew I wasn't a N, right? Packy! On the streets everywhere you went, Packy! Right? People would stop in their cars, or people would be yelling it out on the streets. You're trying to go somewhere. And that was the mid 70s, right through to, like, let's say 1980 and well into the 80s, where if you were out in the world and trying to get along and deal with people in a multicultural world, you were not necessarily going to be accepted. And for the life of me, I don't understand why more brown people aren't talking about that, because it was fairly common and prevalent in going on in those worlds. My high school life, while I think the high school teachers were in their own way sort of benevolent, and one or two did try to speak to me, very early on, I was surrounded almost every day by people taunting and threatening me. And some of the first friends I met at Harvard Collegiate were a guy named Sedgwick, who was Jamaican, Wayne, whose father was Indian and mother African from Trinidad, a guy named Mark, who we later found out was Malkiat, from a Punjabi Sikh guy, and a guy named Eddie, of German background, and another guy named Andy, whose father was an Indian minister of some kind, maybe Presbyterian, I'm not sure. And these were the sort of the first people who befriended me. So there was a small West Indian group, and I was made to feel very welcome. And it was the first time as well, they used to play music, and this young woman invited me to this little club. It must have been called the West Indian Club. And I heard Earth, Wind and Fire for the first time. Mm-hmm. And it blew my mind, You're a Shining Star. I'd never heard music like that. And I guess those rhythms from Trinidad were still welling up in me. The music that my parents used to listen to and brought with them, you know, Sparrow and, you know, 60 Million Frenchmen Could Not Be Wrong, and all these incredible things that I knew as a kid. And suddenly those rhythms were coming back and being among West Indian people. So it was an incredible time for me. It was an incredible time of feeling, finally being welcome among this group of West Indians, while together we're facing a clear indifference by the powers that be among teachers, and clearly a threatening world outside of that. So for me, what happened in those days was my friends would come and tell me, Peter, don't come to school, they're looking for you. And in many ways, I'd be too scared. I was 15, skinny, 16, skinny, 17, skinny, didn't know how to fight, didn't know what to do. And 7 years out, so we were always sort of 7 years in Sudbury and then landing in Toronto with the sophisticated city already made me an outsider. I was wearing, like, you know, I had long shaggy hair and stuff like that, and big glasses. And by that time, you know, things were a little bit more conservative here. And so it took me a long time to get through high school. And by the time it was over, though, I had grown to an extent where I understood that I could not allow other people's expectations of me to rule how I was going to get along in the world. I understood I would have to fight emotionally, intellectually, to be able to move forward. I understood from some advice my father had given me when I was 14, when a bus driver refused to pick me up in Sudbury and I had to walk 3 miles to come home. He said, Peter, they can take your property from you, your home from you, your family from you, even your life. But two things I want you to remember. He said, when you're buried, you'll all go 6 feet under, and they will never take your education from you. And that stuck in me when I was 13 or 14 for some strange reason. And that's why I kept going back to school. So, you know,
did something significant happen to you at school that led you to become the person you are today, as an example, a school principal?
Well, you know, I never, based on what those teachers said to me, and there was a guy named Mr. Burt, who was the vice principal at Harvard in 1980-81, when he ripped up my diploma in front of me and tore it up, and he said, Deboran, you'll never amount to anything.
No way.
And I believed it. I thought, my God, I must be stupid. And my poor parents, coming from Trinidad, having these incredible expectations of this country and believing in authority the way Trinidadian people have to believe in authority, where you don't know how to speak out and you never raise your hand unless spoken to. You know, I've come to reconcile with myself the pain that these people felt, and being told by those teachers, well, we don't, you know, he doesn't, whatever, how they treated me and my sisters. And somehow or another, this spirit in me began to happen. At 19, one of my friends, Julio from Uruguay, he comes to me and he says, Peter, I met this guy. And you know what he said? He said, and I'll never forget that either, and I've used that with my own students. He said, if you want to see people without problems, walk past a graveyard. My God, of course, everybody has problems. And if they can make it, I can make it too. No excuses. What are you going to do? What sacrifice are you going to make? So that was the dawning at 19 years old. The second thing that happened, I went to a new school, and thank God I did. It was located at Lawrence College. I forget now where, and around that area, and College and Lansdowne. I forget the name of it. And it was a high school, so they didn't know me, didn't have that bias against me that they had in Harvard, that I was a troublemaker because I didn't want to come to school. And I got better marks. And I remember talking to this girl outside the school one day. I was in grade 13, and saying, yeah, when I'm done, I'm thinking of going to college. And this one woman, one teacher, is walking by, and she overhears that, and she says to me, Peter, you should go to university. You have the mind for it. Mrs. Berkovich. Of all my years in school, almost 7 years when I think about it, in and out of high school, one teacher. She made all the difference in the world. It still took me a decade. I could dance. I had a little dance group. I felt I belonged there. I was on TV. There was a show called Boogie Electric Circus those days. We were doing hip hop. I ended up getting sort of a scholarship to dance and trained in jazz and modern dance. So I had something I could call my own, and it gave me confidence, but it wasn't going to be academics. Then I ended up with a little company called Gypsy Magic Productions. I started doing Carib Beat, which was a show about West Indian people. And the irony of that is the black folks would call it that coolie show or the Indian show. And the Indian people, oh, you're doing that black show. No, I'm not. I'm doing a show for our people. And that show was winning awards left and right. And then I went to college. I went to Seneca College for Radio and TV Arts. And when I came out, my first job was for Caravana. And we were working with CBC and all that, and we were filming, my own TV show, Caribbeat, was filming Harry Jerome Awards for the first time, Caravana for the first time, filming the opposition leaders and leaders of the province. I didn't know weren't supposed to do that. We were just walking in and doing it. And from there, got another job at UNICEF. Somebody, Leland Gudge, a fantastic guy who was in the Caravana committee, came to me after and said, they're looking for somebody over at UNICEF. You may want to apply for that. And now here I was, 25, 26, and I got the job for a year. But I was also highly political. And, some of the audience members listening to this will understand that. After 1980, I never knew apartheid existed. I had never heard in high school anything about the racial stuff that was going on in the world. I remember a Man in Society class where this teacher was telling me, the United States is racist, but not Canada. We don't have any racism here. Meanwhile, I've been threatened outside every single day outside of school. Somebody coming and says, come on, Deboran, you effing, I'm gonna. 5, 10, 15 guys surrounding me. I'm thinking, okay. I freaked out. I found out about apartheid, and I started to go down to the protests. And I remember those days very well. I think it was on King or Queen Street, and a bunch of us would be saying stuff and chanting and whatever we had to do to end apartheid. And I remember up on the roof of the building opposite us, people pointing out where people were filming us. Whether it's OPP or RCA, whoever it was, as threats to the kingdom, so to speak. And as an offshoot to that, I do remember a good friend, Clifton Joseph, who was well known in the mid 80s as what they call a dub poet. And he was, good friends at the time. He phones me, and we hear this funny clicking on the phone. He says, Peter, your phone is being tapped, man. All these kinds of things that were happening in those days. So it took me a long time. I ended up in politics. I ended up working.
Peter, since you're talking about apartheid and your political activism and you being bullied, led you to fight for the freedom of South Africans.
Absolutely.
I would like Zeb Jiva, who's on the call today, who was such a instrumental in the freeing of Nelson Mandela and establishing the Nelson Mandela Foundation and getting the city to name one of the streets in Toronto, Nelson Mandela Avenue, etc. I mean, it's just an honor that if Zeb, can you chime in here and talk a little bit about what you know about Peter and his activism?
Well, there were. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, all. Thank you so much for watching this interview with Habeeb, Alli, and Peter Deboran. If you're interested in seeing and hearing part 2, which is even more provocative in terms of Canadian politics and Indigenous relations, please click on part 2, which is in the description box. Thank you.